Welcome to Al Ginkgo, your virtual campfire talk with fellow eclectics kindling knowledge synthesis.
Let's start here then, brother. Assalamu alaikum, rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Oh, wow. It's good to see you again, dear brother.
Same here.
Abdul Karim from Kuala Lumpur. I'm Dr. Omar Zaid. And Brother Karim and I have been having an ongoing discussion about some problems that we have perceived in the what appears to be a monolithic overview of Islam, which is not very representative of the actual truth. And we're trying to make some corrective observations so that the Ummah, who is attuned to the truth rather than to mere tradition, is able to see beyond the facades that have been constructed and purposely constructed to misguide the Ummah of Muhammad. We want to try and return to al-Islam as it was handed to us, particularly with respect to governance, which is represented by the Medina Constitution and Charter, which was abjectly discarded almost immediately after the Prophet's death. So we're looking into this, we're looking into hadith, we're looking into several things that have taken precedence in the preoccupations of the Muslim Ummah ritualistically with respect to their practice and their understanding of what has come to the world as Islam. So bear with us, and I think you'll be interested to find some things of importance and maybe even some things which are going to be astonishing to you as we review the errors that have been made. Now, brother, we're in the so-called month of Ramadan, which has come to my attention recently as being one of the major ritualistic errors practiced by the Ummah. And I would like to address this. I would like to address maybe even the gatherings on Friday called Jum'ah, which have very little basis in the Quranic representations, but they're very substantiated in the hadith. Again, for both instances, whether it's Ramadan or the practice of the Jum'ah, most of the literature here and the tafsirs which support either one are coming from the hadith, you see. So, and we've substantially covered many of the errors of the hadith, and we see that many of them have been fabricated by people who have converted to Islam. They were not the original companions, although I know a lot of the hadith are attributed to Abu Hurairah. We don't need to discuss him so much as the fact that the hadith comes from different sources other than the Arabian Peninsula. We know that they're founded most of all on the Persian language and the Persians themselves who converted or so-called converted to Islam. It always disturbed me from the beginning of my introduction to the Ummah that all of this started in the Arabian Peninsula, and then suddenly, after the Prophet's death, everything moves north into Baghdad, and other places, you see. And we have these Damascus and all this sort of thing. And I know the Eastern Orthodox church and governance of Eastern Rome was there. This is not Rome that we understand, not Western Rome, but Eastern Rome. I know that they were there, and there were all sorts of influences taking place. But I also know that there were remnants of Jews in Persian that some people want to call magi and all this sort of thing, left over from Babylon. They had been there for 1,000 years, if not longer, and they had entertained corrupt forms of Zoroastrianism, and much of this crept into the Arabist, you see, language, as I understand it, and then crept into the tafsir and crept into the hadith 150, 180, 200 years after the demise of our beloved prophet. And I think it substantially changed the metaphysical geography, if you will, of al-Islam, so that al-Islam, as was handed to the companions by the prophet, was no longer representative of what was actually given over at the campfires in Medina or in Mecca or wherever it is that they traveled with their camels and with their systems of understanding, so that tafsir and hadith are corrupt. The ritual practices are corrupt. It came to my understanding as I continued my reading of this subject matter that for the first 200 years after the death of the prophet, Muslims couldn't even agree on the Qibla. Some were pointing at Jerusalem, some were pointing at Mecca, some were pointing at a third or fourth point. And nobody understands why these particular spaces in the masjid were in different directions. You see, one pointing south, southwest, east, north. What's going on here? So, as an outsider coming into the quote Arabist persuasion of what is representative as Islam, I look at this and I say, well, there's a great deal of confusion here. And then I see that, oh gosh, after 1400 years, they can't even consider, they can't even agree on how best to pray. You know, they're kind of just tolerating each other, which means that that's an elementary point of confusion, you see. So if the ummah, if the elders, if the alim can't agree on how to pray without coming into contention with each other, how can we trust their judgment on greater matters? You see, so and if they can't, this matter of lifting the figure, how many rakats, and all of this sort of thing, and how long to spend with your head bowed to the ground before you get up, and what you have to say when you're rising, and what you have to say when you're uh, lowering your head in reverence, submission. All of these things, I find them confusing. I always found them confusing. And then when I observed Muslims doing the practice of Ramadan, uh, I saw that, hey, well, they're getting fatter, and the food bills are going up, and they're doing the exact opposite of what some of the traditions that the Prophet said not to do. He said, keep your prayers short. And I would attend these iftars, and the prayers were just, they seemed to last forever, you see, before the ceremonies would even be initiated. So I'm wondering, then I read in the Quran something else that disturbed me. You see, it seems that the Quran is very clear on marking the hypocrite who stands up in front of the congregation and prays just to be seen. And then I'm saying, well, I'm looking at all these opportunities for hypocrites to stand up and be seen. And this is part of the ritual practice of Islam. And I said, well, this is also irrational. So From my perspective, I just look at this as a kind of a, if you will, an armchair scientist, and I'm saying social scientist, and I'm saying, well, the Quran says don't do it, and then at the same time, the alim are saying that the hadith says we must have all these opportunities so the hypocrites can show themselves pious. I'm saying, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why would God contradict himself? And then you tell me and teach me repeatedly that these same people have made it a point of law that the Quran contradicts itself. I'm saying, I'm scratching my head even more. And I'm saying, well, either I'm crazy or these people are out of order, you see. And I'm a medical doctor, and you don't get to that degree of professional expertise without having something under this, hairline here called brains and rational decision making processes. And then I realize, I look and I say, what all these people who are making all this opportunity for hypocrites to stand up and put on their turbans and long robes and pray, they're the same ones who are ignoring science. And so I say, oh gosh, what has happened to Islam here? There's a real knowledge crisis, and I covered this on some of my lectures, and I try to make sense of it. But you see, I'm still confused. And I know we've covered some of these matters, but before we enter into the age of the Ottomans, I would like to see if we can't clarify some of these points, with especially with regard to Ramadan. Now, I've from your perspective is what I'm looking for here, because I've discussed this with instructor Bilal recently, and just yesterday and a few sessions before, and he and a few others have said, well, Ramadan is not a mobile event. It takes place in the autumn, at the end, during the hottest month of the year in Arabia, you see. And they provides reasonable evidence for this. And I say, okay, well, that makes more sense than having it move according to the lunar cycle, and then change every year. And this is more in keeping with other reasonable traditions from other cultures. I mean, this is kind of like the harvest time, and in Arabia, this is the hottest period of the year. It's the driest period of the year. So this is a time when, if you look at Prophet David and the Psalms, he's in Psalm 61 or 67. I think he's praising God's name, and he's saying, "I'm going to sing your praises, even though my lips are parched." You see. So I imagine, well, maybe that's he's either wandering in the desert, dying of thirst almost, or maybe he's celebrating Ramadan, you see, at the right time of the year, even in that ancient time, 1,000, 1,500 years prior to the advent of Muhammad. And that makes sense when you think of how it is that the Quran it announces itself as a mercy to complete and explain what came before, to correct the errors of what came before, which we know has been corrupted. So um, I'm wondering, dear brother, if you can add some insight to my comments. Correct me if I'm wrong in anything that I've said, please, um, and help the Ummah understand what this period, what this thing called Ramadan is all about. Instructor Bilal says that the word actually means remedy. And if you understand anything about the scientific art of fasting, it provides a remedy for the body. So I'm thinking, well, there must also be a provision of the remedy for the spirit as well and the soul. And if that's the case, Muslims are going about it all wrong, because instead of fasting, they're feasting. They can't wait to for the sun to go down so they can return to their shisha pipes and cigarettes, and then feast all night. And then when the sun rises, they sleep all day. So all commerce stops. The medical bills rise, the food bill rises, the waste girth rises, expands, and I'm saying, well, how is this a remedy? You see, how is it a remedy? So, brother, how is it, from your understanding, that this whole um, practice of Ramadan came into being, you see, as an accepted ritual that must absolutely be followed to the point of actually people, I've read stories about people chasing each other down the street, you know, because, some guy, some old man who's not required to fast was munching on something in the middle of the day, and somebody beats him because, he's a more pious Muslim, and this guy's sinning. Please help me to understand how this perversion has occurred, inshallah.
Yes, thank you, Brother Omar, for this opportunity once again to share some thoughts with you and the viewers about Ramadan. But before I begin, let me just do my little dua here. One moment, please.
Inshallah.
Yes. Well, it just so happens that some friends and I just had a very big debate this morning on Clubhouse about precisely this topic, Ramadan. And we have some, how can I put it, fellows there on Clubhouse. Most of us are sort of Quran-centric people. And one of our friends was basically advancing the view that Ramadan, the word sawm, actually does not mean abstaining from food and drink. So now I was leaning towards the traditional view that it does include abstaining from food and drink. However, it may include more than that. And this was the point that the other fellow was emphasizing. He referred to a verse in Surah Maryam where Maryam says that she was going to, if somebody talks to her, she should tell him that, well, I have decided to do Psalm today and I'm not going to speak to anyone. So because there's no mention of any food in that verse, this friend of mine was concluding that, the Psalm doesn't include, refraining from eating food and drink. But the stumbling block that I came across in his explanation, who is otherwise quite a sharp fellow, and he has contributed a lot to our understanding of the Book of Allah. There's a verse which says that once how can I put it, the fasting time is over, then we are supposed to eat and drink. The Arabic use is wakulu washrabu, which means to eat and drink. And I also checked all the translations of the Quran that I found on islamawaken.com, and I think there are 57 of them. And I checked verse 187 in Surah Al-Baqarah, where there's a reference to this kulu washrabu. And I wanted to find out that if there's any translator who translates the word kulu washrabu shrabu as other than drink, and there was no exception. Every single one of them translated as drink. So I was stuck on that verse, that part of the verse, as far as my discussion with him was concerned, because I said to him that if what he is saying is true, that the fasting actually refers to something like withdrawing from social life, retreating somewhere into the corner and making space and reading the Quran and meditating on the signs of Allah. And I don't disagree with that. I agree with that. I think that spiritual part of the Psalm is a very important part of the fasting process. So, Western people, even those who are non-Muslims, often talk about, coming to a higher level of consciousness, remember?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in the 60s and the 70s, there were so many different ways to do this. As you know, the decade of the sex and drugs and rock and roll, and a lot of people were
Yes, of course.
experimenting with drugs also, and what have you. There's a long history of that, and Woodstock and the whole flower generation business. So, and also even the guru, an Indian guru, and meditations and yoga, all of these were different ways of trying to attain that high level of consciousness, realizing one's
Mm-hmm.
full potential, as an expression often used. So I don't agree, I didn't disagree with him. I agreed with him that yes, the word sound includes a spiritual awakening, if you like. But I thought that if you accepted his view that it does not include, abstaining from food and drink, then the term washrabu, wakulu washrabu, eat and drink, would have to be referring to the Quran. And I asked him, well, how do you consume the Quran, you see, and how do you drink the
Mm-hmm.
Quran? It doesn't fit, is what I was saying. So he and some of other people in the room countered by saying, well, there's a reference in the Quran where the Bani Israel, I think they drank the spirit or the calf, when Musa went off and they began worshipping the calf. I think the word used, the Arabic word used, was that they drank the calf. Yeah. So,
Mm-hmm.
in other words, they're suggesting that word drink, shurabu, can be used in a metaphorical way also, that it should
Mm-hmm.
not be taken only literally. So now this actually points to a larger challenge, because as we know, Al-Quran presents itself as containing two types of verses: the muhkamat, the basic and fundamental, and the mutashabihah, the allegorical, or the ones that imply some kind of similarity. And we,
Yes.
of course, most people will agree that the literalist approach, some of the Salafi brothers take that approach. They take even the so-called, mutashabi verses, which are the metaphorical verses, they take them literally, so that when Allah
Mm-hmm.
refers to, when there's a reference to the hand of Allah, or the face of Allah, or the throne of Allah, they take that to be literally. They take it, they
Mm-hmm.
understand it literally, even though this is a metaphorical, allegorical verse. So
Mm-hmm.
that seems to be a mistake that they are making. But, and I'm coming now to our friends in the Quran-centric group, my feeling is that they might be committing a similar mistake, but the other way around. Yeah, because some of them tend to read the verses that should be taken literally, the muhkamat verses, and they interpret them as if they were mutashabihat, as if they were allegorical. So that, for instance, the word, how do I put it? What's a better example? So one example that they frequently use is the wudu before prayer. They say that this is not to be taken literally, that it does not refer to a literal washing of the hands, so that wash your hand up to your elbow. They claim that the word elbow there does not literally mean an elbow, but rather something else. So now with the psalm, something is, I think something similar is happening, is that they seem to suggest that the eating and drinking does not refer to food, but rather to something else, namely the Quran, for example. And they have, given some other examples also in terms of how we can, consume. In fact, one of my friends used an argument, one of my own arguments against me, so to speak, because I sometimes like to say that what we serve there in a clubhouse room is food for thought, you see. So
Mm-hmm.
so she says to me, but, Leslie, this is how my friends on Clubhouse know me. But you yourself said that, we serve here food for thought. So we are consuming thought, right? And so now if the Quran contains thoughts, we are, in a way, taking this is food for thought for us, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Quran. So in that sense, we can, consume and drink food. But I'm not convinced of the argument, and I think that the meaning of the word sawm here in Ramadan should be taken, as I suggested, in both ways. That yes, it does mean refraining from eating food and drink, but it also has this broader other spiritual meaning, which is the purification of the soul. And of course, as a doctor, I'm sure you know that fasting has some benefits. You know, the toxins tend to leave your body. And I know from personal experience, for instance, when I do my own work and writing, I eat very little in the earlier part of the day. And my biggest meal comes sometime at 5 p.m. or so, because I know I cannot really think properly, and I don't have the same clarity of mind with a lot of food in my stomach. And I remember one time, even before I became a Muslim, I was actually forced. I could not eat because my throat was so sore. I couldn't swallow anything for a day or two. So I went without any food in those 1 or 2 days, and I realized suddenly I had a very interesting experience. I felt my mind became incredibly clear, and I said to myself, "OMG, this is really amazing. I really have to do this again," I said to myself. It was an accidental discovery, you know. And so I know not everybody feels that way about it, like the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in his book called Will to Power. He says some very nasty things about fasting, but I think he's totally off the mark. I don't think he at all has knows what he's talking about here. He completely misunderstands, you know, the benefits of fasting. So I believe, yes, there are benefits of fasting, but I agree also with what you said earlier, that some of our Muslim brothers and sisters tend to, you know, go overboard when they break the fast and eat so much as to compensate for what they missed earlier. That you know, it doesn't seem right to indulge so much, you know, in and so to speak, catching up. But in terms of the origins of the, you know, month of Ramadan, it is the month in which the Quran was sent down. All right. Now, in terms of when it begins and related questions, I have to confess, these questions were not at the center of my research in the last little while. So it would probably be wise of me to refrain from attempting to comment on these questions. Maybe someone who has done more work in this area, it would be better to maybe discuss this issue with him. But I just shared my thoughts about this issue that is now some Muslim brothers are advocating that the fasting during the Ramadan does not include abstaining from food, and I don't agree with it. I think it does include that, but it is not restricted only to that. So I would put it that way. My thoughts on that topic. Thank you.
I see. Thank you very much. Let's return then to the practice of Friday prayer. There seems to be some discussions going on and disagreements going on with respect to the origin. Someone commented not too long ago to me that, excuse me, I have a bit of a head cold these last week or so. Well, if there was established Friday prayer, especially from the time that of the Hijrah of Muhammad to Medina, then we should have about 500 odd sermons, you know, given by the Prophet every Friday, and none of these are recorded. So, but there's also, you know, these have been neglected, yet all these hearsay in the hadith has been recorded. So, how does one reconcile that? And where does the Jum'ah fit in to the ritual life of the Muslim, the practicing Muslim, from your perspective?
Yes, once again, thank you. And again, this is a question that we have also discussed in our clubhouse rooms. And in fact, again, the fellow who was, as it were, you know, questioning this is actually the same fellow that I was referring to earlier. He's a pretty sharp fellow, and I think he has got some excellent insights. But once again, I think we need to be very, very careful when we, you know, interpret, as it were, the Quran. He is right. He likes to emphasize that the meaning of words in the Quran depends on the context. Absolutely. Context is essential. So now, once again, we had this debate as to whether there is such a thing at all as not just the number of prayers. That has been also discussed, because the more traditionally minded people, and even the meaning of Salat, that has been discussed extensively, you see. So, but whether the issue of the congregational prayer and Yes, this has been one of the other issues, among the issues that has been haunting our rooms, and we have been trying to, come to answers to these questions. And once again, I have to confess that for me personally, the jury is still out on this question. So rather than making a mistake and committing myself to a point of view, I prefer to give myself, if possible, a little more time to come to a better understanding of it. However, you are right, and this point has been raised also in our clubhouse rooms. Why is there no record of the khutbahs if so many have been given? And why do we have, for example, 3,000 or more hadiths from one person who was not even close to the Prophet, Abu Huraira, which is almost half of Bukhari, you see? So, I mean, the short answer to the question of why do we have so many hadiths is probably that they were used for polemical reasons, for political reasons, to propagate, to make a particular person look better and another person perhaps look not so attractive. So there's a lot of politics behind this. And but in terms of the congregational prayer, right, this once again requires careful study, especially in view of the fact that, as this fellow from Bosnia pointed out in his book, his name is Sukrija Husejn Ramic. He published a book published by the, I believe, the one of the UK universities, Cambridge University, Islamic Texts Society. The book is called Language and the Interpretation of Islamic Law, and it's available online in PDF format for those who want to look at it. And he makes a very interesting observation that at least half a dozen very key Arabic words have changed their meaning substantially from the time of the revelation of the Quran until now. And one example I can give, for example, is the word qalb, which is, according to the Quranic Arabic, actually means brain or the mind, but it is understood to be the heart. And only one translator, his name is Muhammad Shafi, not the same as Idris Shafi. This translator is the only one who translates the word qalb as mind. Dr. Omar Ramahi, he resides in Canada, and he's got some excellent videos on YouTube on Islam. And he published a book recently called Muslims' Greatest Challenge, Choosing Between Islam and Tradition. It gives an analysis of what was going on here, and he also argues that the word qalb, in original Quranic Arabic, meant brain, but it has come to mean heart. And this, to him, and I tend to incline to agree with his analysis, reflects a kind of shift from an intellectual understanding of revelation to an emotional understanding of the revelation, because the heart is the seat of emotions, but the brain is the place where we do the thinking. So once again, to come back to the issue of the congregational prayer, we need to look at the text very carefully. And the one additional challenge that we face in this task is, do we want to take into account external sources or not? Now, I am in principle not opposed to external sources, as long as we keep them in perspective, you see. I am even willing to consider the hadith as a source of information, but under some strict conditions, you see. We cannot make the hadith equal to the Quran. We cannot place it above the Quran. We cannot treat it as revelation. We cannot treat it as legislation, and we should not treat it as something binding, but at best, assuming it agrees with the Quran, as something recommended. And in fact, this was the position, I believe, of the muhaddithun, who, according to a book on the differences between the muhaddithun and fuqaha on the issue of hadith, written by Muhammad Ghazali, Sheikh of Al-Azhar University, the muhaddithun took the view that the hadiths are something recommended, sunnah, in the sense that it is something recommended but not binding. While the fuqaha are treating the hadith as something binding, in other words, a source of Islamic law and legislation. So I'm inclined to the view that the hadith at best can be treated, yes, as hikmah, definitely, as long as it agrees with the Quran and doesn't ask you to do anything against the Quran, but never ever as Islamic legislation or revelation or as binding. So I would therefore incline to the view that in our interpretation of the Quran, of course, the context is the Quran, the whole Quran of a particular word, but we can look even outside of the Quran under those strict conditions which I have outlined. And this is a position taken even by Taha Jabir al-Wani, who is, by the way, a Sunni scholar, you see. So I'm not propounding anything new here as far as I can tell. He writes in his book called Reviving the Balance, 2017, triple IT, that the hadith should have never been written down. It should have been left in an oral form.
Yes.
Because it created all kinds of problems. You know, the hadith began to be treated as wahi, second revelation. Then it came to be treated as legislation. Then finally, even the work of the ulama was treated eventually as legislation. You see, and of course, eventually even the hadith and the rulings of the ulama actually, in some cases, overruled the rulings of Allah. This is just unbelievable. And Jabir al-Wani notes this, and so does Dr. Muhammad Shahrur. These are some things that went badly wrong in traditional exegesis and jurisprudence. I refer to these instances, I don't know, maybe I did coin a new expression, but I felt I had to find some name for it. So I described making the hadith equal to the Quran. I said, well, to me, this looks like an example of what we could call scriptural shirk, associating a partner with the Book of Allah, right? So I'm not saying that it is shirk per se. I'm not saying that the people who are doing this are polytheists or mushrikeen, but what I'm saying is that the practice seems to me like an expression of a kind of scriptural shirk, because we are giving a partner, to the Book of Allah. And some scholars, Ibn Baz, for example, go so far as to say that the Sunnah, the Hadith, actually become part of the Quran. Yeah, not just a partner, not a partner, but a part of. You see, so in other words, we have one big thing, big stuff, a mix of words of human beings and the words of Allah. Now, what am I supposed to make of this? I think this is a very serious, I would even not hesitate to refer to it as an assault on the Book of Allah by mixing it with the words of human beings, a kind of dilution of the message, and in fact a kind of what's the right word? Corruption of the divine text. You see, and another source that I have read even claims that not only the Sunnah is the part of the Quran, but even the tafsir of the ulama becomes part of the Quran. So my goodness, now the crowd seems to be expanding. Now that we have so many, authors of revelation. Now, is this right? Is this taking us in the right direction? And to the other practice, replacing the rulings of Allah by rulings drawn from tradition or rulings of the ulama. I would refer to it as I suggested we could think of it as a juristic shirk, because jurisprudence is the science where we, infer the laws of the Sharia from its source, which is the Book of Allah. So, so to come back to the main issue, the meaning of the congregational prayer or the Friday prayer, I think that would require an exhaustive study and a detailed look at the relevant verses, and also some historical, perhaps, look into what we have outside of the Quran. In other words, see if there's anything relevant that we can use. But so for the time being, I have to. My friend, by the way, suggested that the Salah in the Quran refer to the times when the Prophet used to recite the Quran to the people. So you see how quite unorthodox his perception is. Now, like I say, we need to study this further. And my attitude is that we take the meaning of a Quranic verse, the first meaning that strikes us, and we stick with that meaning until we come across a good reason for departing from it. And I personally follow the policy that, I practice Islam the way the people in the community in which I live practice it. As long as it does not go against the Quran, I have no problem, following it. Of course, if it departs from the Quran, and then of course I would have to, hold back and say, but so far I have not really been put into a position where I had to do that in any, major sort of way. Although I remember that when I mentioned to some of my relatives that why do we Muslims put two names on inside the masjids, the looks that I received from the people that heard me make this comment indicated to me that I better change the subject quickly, and I did, because they were quite taken aback that I have raised it in the first place. And when I raised the same issue with one academic from Malaysia, whom I met at the institute while I was still there, what he told me was that, oh, but we don't want the Wahhabi style of Islam here, basically. That's how he was justifying putting two names in the masjids, because, two names indicates a duality, right? But in Islam, we have monotheism and we have the unity of Allah. So where does the duality come from? Some people in Yemen, apparently, they put even the names of the Sahaba on the wall. And I sometimes ask my friends a similar question about the so-called principle of dual revelation. I ask them, can we have a duality of revelation without having a duality of divinity? Please, what's your point? How do you explain this? Or somehow, sometimes I put the question slightly differently. Can we have two sources of Islam without, if you say there's a second source of Islam, aren't you saying can you have a second source of Islam without postulating a second God? Let me put it that way. So I'm not saying that what we have now is a kind of, I see these dualisms as a threat to Tawheed. I'm not saying that it has already happened. It is a threat, and I think we have to guard against it by upholding the preeminence and supremacy of the Quran over all tradition. And this is basically what Taha Jabir Alwani also says, and I think Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman. And in the old days, the Mutakallimun, the Ahl al-Kalam, who were basically Quranists at the times, you might say, because they didn't accept any hadith. They were the precursors of the Mu'tazilites, and they were the people with whom Imam al-Shafi had his debates, you see. So the debate was not so much, I think, between the rationalists and the Ahl al-Hadith, but rather between the Ahl al-Quran and Ahl al-Hadith, you see. But anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that we need to undertake a very careful study when it comes to, say, the Friday prayer. We need to look at the relevant verses and do a in-depth, detailed study, and come to some kind of a conclusion. But at the moment, I am not in a position. I have, like I said, my research interests are not directly on that topic, although of course I am interested. But I think if you perhaps want to pursue that more, in greater detail, I don't know whether there's. I'm sure there are some people that, I don't know. You might want to ask Brother Edip Yüksel, for his views on this.
Yes.
He was, by the way, one of the people who was chased down the street in Tehran during Ramadan when he was eating something, and a couple of shopkeepers began to chase him, but with sticks, and they wanted to beat him. And he's told me that, well, these people don't ask whether I'm traveling, because if I'm traveling, I don't have to fast. Whether I'm a Muslim, if I'm not a Muslim, I don't have to fast. They simply jump to conclusion. And he mentioned this to me in a context of this famous verse in Al Quran where Allah refers to the Muslims as the Ummatan Khairan, the best community, because they do what in the Quran is known as Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. They command what is right and discourage what is wrong. So when I told about this verse to Brother Edip, he said that yes, but this verse can be abused, and it happened to me, because the people that chased after me wanted to prevent something wrong, and the wrong thing was me eating on the street. So that verse has been misinterpreted by many people, Islamists mainly, militant ulama, to lend credibility to use of force in enforcing Islamic, practices and beliefs on people. So I'm sorry that I cannot be any more help than this, but
no,
for the moment.
That's quite all right. That's quite all right. I've been wrestling with this concept of community prayer for quite some time with respect to the Ummah in particular. And I don't see a proper formula being exercised. Um, to, to my satisfaction. That's just a personal observation. Um, I know from other cultures and even other religious persuasions that communal prayer is something that is either politically oriented or it's celebratory. For example, if you take the monotheist Native American tribes, they each had their own approach to a celebratory communal event, which would include some sort of prayer. And this also includes the recitation of the oral tradition. Now, my observation here with respect to the oral tradition is pretty much the same as those who object to the hadith being written down, because the oral tradition in the Native American and other cultures is something that was not meant to be written down. It was handed word of mouth, generation to generation, and certain of the children were observed in their early development by the elders, the respected elders, and they would come to a certain age between 5 and 7 years old, and they would then decide that's the one. Or they would say that's the group amongst which is the one who's supposed to take up the stick, the memory stick for the next generation. And then they would be taught the entire history of their people, including the cosmology. Okay. And whether it's Native American or some tribe up in the hills in Uzbekistan, it makes no difference. But when the Native Americans came together to celebrate, for example, let's just say Little Bear went out to the woods and he killed a bear and he became Big Bear. Okay. So he's going to celebrate his name change. Okay. Because now he's a man, he's approaching 29 years of age. He's made the big kill. He's brought the meat back to share with the entire village. He's got the bear skin. He's probably going to make a gift of that to somebody, or maybe to his wife, or whatever the case might be. Or maybe he's going to wear it as some sort of trophy from here on out to mark his skill as a huntsman. So the entire tribe turns out to celebrate this event, you see. And the first thing they do before celebrating the event is they dance. You see, the drum, there's a fire lit. And this is not fire worship. I'm not talking about fire worship. The fire represents Noor as far as they're concerned. So, and they're reflecting the Noor that is within them in a celebratory fashion. And then the first thing that happens is after the fire is lit, the drums start going. Then they said, hi, hi, oh, yeah. Then everybody starts dancing around the fire. Well, if you go into a Pentecostal church celebration on Sunday morning, you see the same thing. They even use the fire symbol, you see, and they're out in the aisles and they're all dancing. And this is, if you ask the Native American what they're doing, if you stop a Native American who's out there in the middle of his dance and you pull him out of the crowd and you say, what are you doing? He's going to say, I'm praying. I'm making my prayer. I'm celebrating the awesomeness, the divinity of the Great Spirit. I'm celebrating it because I experienced it in honor of my companion who's now Big Bear, you see? So this is their experience. And then after the dance, everybody settles down. Then the elder shaman stands up and he recites the history. He recites the dhikr. You see, that's the dhikr. It's not sitting there going Alhamdulillah 30,000 times. No, no, no. The dhikr is the story. It's the narrative. It's the locution of their cultural history, of their tribal history. And so after that, then the celebration kind of ends. Now maybe the chief might stand up and then say a few words about Little Bear no longer being Little Bear. Now he's Big Bear, and embracing him and stamping him with the stamp of manhood, with approval. You see, so this is certification of Little Bear's identity as Big Bear. You see, so this is a communal prayer. This, to me, is communal prayer. Communal prayer to me does not represent a bunch of people bending over repetitive times and then listening to some boring khutbah and falling to sleep while the guy's giving it in some sort of, you know, um, how should I say, some sort of a formulaic ritual. No, that's not communal prayer for me. There's no opportunity there for individualism. There's no opportunity for collective expression. None. You see, you might as well be a bunch of communists all wearing the same uniforms, reciting the same things. You see, whereas if you go to the Pentecostal church or the Native American dance in honor of Little Bear, you you've got a completely different communal expression of individuality, celebrating the confirmation of another individual spirit. You see, all in honor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Great Spirit. You see. Now, the only difference between the Pentecostals and the Native Americans is that, they call Jesus the Great Spirit. Okay, they're sociologically, there's no difference, you see. Psychologically, there's no difference. So that's a theological, point of departure, but the event is the same, you see. So I'm looking at what you just said about some comment there that, well, yeah, it's likely that the prophet, on these communal events recited Quran or during, one moment of prayer. Maybe it was the middle prayer. Remember the middle prayer, the Quran says. Well, what does that mean? You see, no one's answered that to me satisfactorily. So I don't know. My jury's still out on that. But if that's what he was doing, that's more in concert, you see, with the oral traditions. Because what is the Quran? It's the dhikr. It's the narrative. It's a divine narrative. You see, that's the same thing that the shaman from the Native American tribe was doing in honor of the Great Spirit. What what was the prophet doing there? In honor of the Great Spirit, whom we call Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The name is different, but the intention and the goal of that prayer is the same: to return our light, to return our honor uh, and dignity as human beings, to mirror what it is that Allah subhanahu, the Great Spirit, has given to us. So I don't see any points of contention between the communal prayers I just expressed with the Pentecostals or with the Native Americans and what perhaps really occurred when the prophet walked the earth. You see, I'm still exploring, and when I have conversations like this with people like yourself, it's still part of my active research. I'm saying, well, what do you think? This is what I think. What do you think? What have you heard from others, you see, of your peers and superiors about this matter? Because what I see in the Ummah is a formula for failure. It's not a formula for success. You see, after 1400 years to 1200 years of doing the same thing every Friday, doing the same thing every EID, doing the same thing every Ramadan, they're still failing. Now, if you want to counter that by saying, well, the success is for the hereafter. Okay, well, I can accept that maybe 50%. But the prophet established the here. He established the dominion of the Ummah for the here on earth. In other words, dominion means bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth, which is what Isa said he would do in the Gospel of Barnabas. So I see that the prophet brought it, and that then the Ummah did exactly what the Jews did in the days of Samuel. They rejected the kingdom of Allah under the prophet and replaced it with the monarchical kingdom of the earth. You see, the kings of the earth, which is of the shaitan, which is of the unredeemed nafs. So I'm looking at all of this from that perspective. This is why I ask these questions. The premise being, well, if this formula was correct, dominion should have been maintained. justice should have been maintained. You see, now the traditionalists are defending the formula, but they're ignoring the failures. That doesn't make sense to me. I'm using my noodle here, and see. So here's a psychological, a philosophical premise. If this is correct, then it equals success here
Yeah.
and hereafter. Now, when the Prophet entered
Yeah.
Medina, just like
Um,
Moses told the people before they entered Jordan, crossed the Jordan, and entered the Promised Land, he said, "Look, if you do these three things, you obey God, you fear Him, reverence Him, and you remember Him, you will never lose dominion." Muslims have lost dominion, so their formulas must be incorrect. Something
right.
is
Yeah.
wrong. Okay, brother.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to get at or emphasize in these discussions that I hold with you and yourself and other people. So, with that having been said, I'm not really summarizing everything because it's kind of difficult to discuss something if the jury's still out, you see. But at least we can put the cards on the table and then turn them over one by one by one. Like you said, you're turning over the stones. Well, let's turn this one over. Let's turn this one over next time. Let's turn this over and see what we find. You see,
Inshallah.
I'm not going to adhere to the takfiri formula, which is just go to khutbah, go to Jum'ah, practices as everyone else practices, and don't discuss these things. I refuse to do that. It's just not in my nature. It's no different than when I was a little altar boy under the corrupt priest and nuns at the time. I started turning their stones over when you know, I was still changing my teeth. So um, I haven't changed much over the years, dear brother. Alhamdulillah.
So you were rolling some stones, so to speak, right?
Yes, yes, I was rolling the stones even then. So, do you have anything to add before we close here, dear brother?
No, I don't think so. You are right. It's work in progress, and let's see if we can unearth any more relevant information on this topic. Yeah, that sounds like an interesting direction to proceed with.
Okay. Well, if I find anything that's more relevant, I'll bring it up next time. But let's see if we can't push ahead in our next meeting and enter the Ottoman age from your perspective. All right.
The
Uh,
Ottoman Age. Yeah, all right. Sounds.
okay. Wassalamu alaikum wa
Yeah,
rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brother. Thank you once again for sharing this time with us.
most welcome, and thank you too, brothers. Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.